I'm going to continue talking about the conducting division or zone of the respiratory tract. So I recently finished the nasal cavity. Now we're going to work our way down through the pharynx, larynx, and trachea. Your pharynx, of course, is your throat, and it attaches the nasal cavity to the oral cavity. And the pharynx has three different regions or zones with three different names, depending on their location. The nasopharynx is the part of the pharynx just posterior to the nasal cavity. And an important thing about it is the fact that air has to take a 90-degree turn downward to get through from the nasal cavity down into the pharynx. So that abrupt change in direction means that the mucus lining that area can trap larger particles. So as the air makes that sharp curve, some of the debris that might have been inhaled can get trapped in the mucus right there at the nasopharynx, so that we don't allow that debris down into the lungs. The area of the pharynx just posterior to the oral cavity is called the oropharynx, oro meaning oral, mouth. And it's important not just for breathing, but also for swallowing. Finally, the area of the pharynx just near the voice box, or larynx, is called the laryngopharynx. And the laryngopharynx is a common passageway for both air and food. And what's really important is when you swallow, a flap called the epiglottis slams down over the larynx so that food will be guided down into the laryngopharynx and down ultimately into the esophagus, ensuring that food won't go down into the lungs. As I was just mentioning, the epiglottis is part of the larynx. It's a flap of tissue on the superior end or top of the larynx, and it can slam down and protect the opening of the larynx called the glottis. The lumen or opening inside of the larynx is referred to as the glottis. So the epiglottis sits on top of that opening, which is why it's called the epiglottis, epi meaning on top, and it's a flap to protect the glottis from food and any large particles from getting down into your voice box. Every once in a while it doesn't quite slam shut in time, so if you've ever kind of swallowed wrong and you started choking or coughing, that's when your epiglottis didn't slam shut in time, and the body's automatic response is to start to cough, to force air up through the epiglottis and hopefully dislodge whatever it is that might have gotten stuck under the epiglottis, chunk of food, whatever it might be. Inside your larynx, it is your voice box. You would find vocal cords, and they're tight flaps of tissue lining the sides of the larynx. And depending on how you hold and orient that tissue, air traveling through the larynx can vibrate that tissue to create sound. Okay, moving beyond the pharynx and larynx, you go down into the trachea. And the trachea is made up of cartilage, but that cartilage is not round, it's C-shaped. Take a look at the image to the right. That's a cross-section view of the trachea. The yellow would be the cartilage, and notice that the yellow is a C shape rather than a full ring. And that's important because just on the back side or posterior side of the trachea is your esophagus. And if you eat a really big chunk of food, let's say you eat a big tortilla chip or something and you don't chew it into small pieces, that massive chunk of food in the esophagus can expand into the lumen or cavity of the trachea. So if you take a really big swallow of food, the esophagus can expand temporarily into the trachea to accommodate that big chunk of food. So the posterior side of the trachea, the posterior wall, is where the esophagus is. All right, we've got to keep our trachea clean and free of debris and pathogens, so we line it with mucus. And the walls of the trachea are lined with cells that have little hairs on them called cilia. And what happens is you produce mucus, and the mucus coats those cells, and then as debris is trapped in that mucus, the cilia of those cells can push the mucus up towards your pharynx. We call it the mucociliary escalator. And that way we can trap something bad, like say a bacterial cell or a virus or whatever, dirt, debris, anything you need to trap and get rid of, will ride up the mucociliary escalator to the pharynx, and you'll swallow that mucus down into the stomach, and ultimately that mucus will become part of feces.